The father and son were fishing on the riverbank when suddenly a shoe fell from the sky, followed by toxic items falling to the ground. Who would have expected that a plane full of criminals had an air accident? Fortunately, thanks to the pilot's efforts, a plane crash and loss of lives were avoided. But no one can imagine, after the death row inmate miraculously survived and regained his freedom, what disaster he would bring to the area's residents. We go back in time a few hours, where a prisoner transport plane suddenly received instructions from the High Command to temporarily stop at the Air Force Base in Alaska, because there is a criminal who also needs to be transferred to Washington. The accompanying soldiers on the road were in a state of high alert, while the prisoners in the cabin looked curiously at this new prisoner who joined them. Separate locks were installed on his limbs and head, and even when sitting on the seat, several layers of security had to be added. Everyone exchanged looks, as they were originally dangerous criminals, but compared to the person in front of them, they seemed like law-abiding citizens. It wasn't long before the plane took off into the dark sky, and the heavy prisoner who joined midway began to fidget, and a tooth implanted with a pin fell out, as he seemed to be trying to unlock the restraints on his body. When his limbs suddenly regained freedom, a loud bang was heard from outside, and one side of the plane caught fire. Passengers screamed in terror, and some of the prisoners closest to the outside were immediately sucked into the air. As for that dangerous prisoner here, he seemed to have anticipated it, and calmly continued to free himself. When the plane began to descend uncontrollably, the prisoner finally regained his freedom. When confronted by the police officers, he knocked them down with 3 punches and 2 kicks. The pilot did not have time to pay attention to anything else and exerted all his effort to stop the descent. The passengers in the cabin floated in the air due to weightlessness, but unfortunately, this state did not last long. In the end, the plane fell uncontrollably towards the ground. Fortunately, there was no second explosion. Then the accompanying guards either died or were injured. The surviving prisoners began trying to unlock their handcuffs, which was like a rebirth for them in a small town on the border of Alaska. Deputy Director Frank was going to work as usual, and had not yet sat down when he received a call from the fire department. A large amount of smoke appeared in the northern forest, and due to the roads being covered with ice and snow, Frank had to pilot a helicopter for reconnaissance. Following the direction of the rising smoke, everyone quickly reached the crash site, and once they saw the plane broken in half, they almost screamed in astonishment. When the helicopter landed, Frank hurriedly exited the cabin and saw from a distance the bodies of some judicial police officers lying on the ground with some handcuffs on the snow beside them. Frank had a bad feeling, and it seemed that the crashed plane was not an ordinary passenger plane. At that moment, he noticed that there was a judicial police officer who had not yet lost consciousness and was preparing to call his colleagues. Suddenly, a large number of prisoners emerged from the forest carrying handmade weapons and began attacking Frank and his companions frantically. The overweight man accompanying them was slow to react and was stabbed several times with sharp metal. Frank shouted in anger, drew his gun, and fired without hesitation. The prisoners froze for a few moments, then charged bravely without fear. Frank couldn't face the large numbers with his hands alone, and soon found himself in a weak position. Fortunately, at the critical moment, the injured officer picked up the gun, which relieved a lot of pressure. Frank seized the opportunity, got back on his feet, and finally managed to control those violent thieves who quickly sneaked into the plane. Even as the helicopter rose into the air, there were prisoners trying to climb inside. Frank didn't hesitate to kick them away. It wasn't long before the helicopter reached the edge of the forest on the road. He first placed his injured colleague Debing and the surviving officer in the ambulance, then issued instructions to the officers. That ill-fated plane was designated for transporting federal prisoners, and these people are synonymous with violence and brutality, and will not miss this opportunity to regain their freedom. Fortunately, the plane crash site was deep in the snow-covered mountains, and in addition to sending police forces to surround the plane site, they also had to close the roads leading to the forest to prevent these criminals from sneaking into the town. After arranging everything, Frank did not forget to advise his wife Sarah to have the hospital ready to receive the injured. His colleague was seriously injured. As soon as he finished the call, Frank's phone rang again. The caller was a CIA agent named Seed. A few minutes ago, he received instructions from his superiors to travel immediately to Alaska to help Frank capture the escaped criminals. Frank felt suspicious. This department is not a charity that likes to help. Could these prisoners have something special? So he immediately approached a surviving federal officer to try to find out exactly what happened on the ill-fated plane. This officer did not have much information, but he clearly remembers that dangerous prisoner who boarded the plane mid-flight, as he was held in a separate cell. The treatment he received was clearly different from the others, even if the plane crashed. This prisoner seemed very calm. The marshal felt that he was the one who brought down the plane. Frank became more curious, but he didn't have the energy to delve into the matter because the entire town went on alert. The ill-fated flight had a total of 52 prisoners. Currently, 23 have been counted as deceased and 11 arrested, which means there are 18 criminals missing or on the run. The police are urging residents to be cautious, and it is best not to go out unless necessary. Even schools have gone into lockdown. On the same afternoon, a CIA agent arrived at the crash site. Frank had many questions in his heart. Why did the plane change its course halfway? What is the origin of that dangerous prisoner? However, Mr. refused to answer everything on the grounds of secrecy. His only mission here is to help capture the fugitives. Frank was immediately angry, as he knew well that the agent only cared about that dangerous prisoner who boarded the plane mid-flight. But Frank's responsibility is to protect the town's security, and he must capture all 18 escapees. Sid remembered the instructions of the previous leaders. This character, Frank, worked in the major crimes unit in Chicago 6 years ago, then was transferred to this remote town to work. And for 5 years, not a single murder occurred in the town thanks to his diligent efforts. Sid thought he would need Frank's help to catch the criminals, so he decided to reveal some secrets to him. That prisoner who boarded the plane mid-flight is named, and was originally an agent specially trained by the CIA. He was his direct superior and mentor. Initially, he showed excellent performance, but suddenly lost contact last month, and secret information disappeared with him. All evidence indicates that Luke betrayed the CIA and stole the information. But 2 days ago, he was arrested at the border, so the CIA forced a transport plane to return him to Washington, despite the lack of any evidence. However, he insisted that the plane incident was orchestrated and that he was planning a bigger conspiracy. After listening, he felt astonished and wanted to continue searching for more evidence. Suddenly, the phone rang in his pocket, and it was his wife calling. Frank hurried to the hospital and saw his wife coming out of the room of the sole survivor of the accident. The other person's injuries are relatively stable, and he can leave the hospital after a few days of rest. However, his colleague Daba was not as fortunate, as he suffered severe internal bleeding. Unfortunately, he passed away after several hours of rescue efforts. This incident was a great shock to Sarah, as she feels that this case is not ordinary, and hopes that the husband will prioritize the family and try to stay away from it. But before Frank could respond, his phone rang again. Frank immediately headed to the command center, where the transportation department provided an important lead. The observer living in the watchtower in the forest sent an unencrypted signal, and when trying to contact him, there was no response. Everyone's initial reaction was that the observer had been kidnapped by the fugitive. However, that tower is located 32 kilometers away from the plane crash site, and it's not a place easily accessible to an ordinary person. But who would have thought that Mr. insists that the dangerous criminal Luke can certainly do it? It wasn't long before the bearded fugitive in the tower revealed that there was movement outside. And no sadi outside ha malaya faria karama faitai. Then he saw the radio on the table was on, and immediately guessed that the observer had sent a signal outside. At this time, Frank had led the large team down the mountain. Mr. repeatedly emphasized to everyone that the fugitive Luke was extremely brutal, and asked everyone to be extremely cautious. The team quickly reached the cabin in the watchtower, and when they opened the door, they found it completely empty, until they found someone in the storage room. They found the observer tied up, but as soon as he bent down, the bearded man surprised him. The others heard the noise and rushed to help, but they did not expect that the bearded man had kidnapped the observer and fled outside. The police gathered in a circle, and the chief started shouting, demanding everyone to open fire. But Frank was thinking of capturing the bearded man alive. During the confrontation, Sid picked up the axe and cut the dog's iron chain, and the dog rushed towards the bearded man. A fight began between them in front of everyone, until the warden blew his whistle, and the dog stopped attacking. Unfortunately, the bearded man's throat was already cut, and Frank's face was filled with disbelief. Did the legendary traitor agent die so easily? But the gentleman shook his head in disappointment. Everyone returned to the camp disappointed. The other officers also found the bodies of some escapees in the snow. The gentleman identified them one by one, and confirmed that none of them was the one he was looking for. However, one of the bodies caught his attention as there were no bruises from the cuffs on his wrist, indicating he was not a prisoner. Frank quickly compared the facial features with the marshal's files and confirms that the deceased was Marshal Robert. But Frank clearly remembers that the surviving marshal is also named Robert. He immediately understood that it was a disguise by the fugitive Luke, so he called his wife at the hospital right away. Unfortunately, the warning was too late as the fugitive Luke had revealed his true identity. When Frank rushed to the hospital, the criminal Luke and his wife Sarah had already disappeared. This is the latest thriller and mystery series for the year 2025 titled Losing the Edge. This series is updated with a new episode every week, and it seems its quality won't be bad, so we ask friends who like it to keep following, and we'll see you in the next episode.